Part 2, Chapter 23 of If All These Young Men by Romer Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 2, London, Chapter 23, Tragic Muse. That evening Blanchard went with Amaryllis, the Franklins, and Mary Laurie to the opera. The air was beautiful and fair, and there was a cool wind blowing that shivered the little leaves on the plane trees and gave Kingsway the pale, enchanted look of Paris in spring. Blanchard's sad hour with Susan had left him in a high state of emotion and a little abnormal, so that he was not sure that what he said was spoken by him, nor that what he saw existed. The whole world was out of focus, and he neither heard nor understood quite clearly what Amaryllis, with whom he walked, was talking about. Yet in the middle of his body, which he felt upon him as if it were closed, his soul hung, hypersensitive to every sound and thought around him. When he had walked a little way, however, he asserted himself and recaptured his body. They passed under the terracotta and white pillars of Drury Lane, and went up the steps amongst many other people, and as Blanchard held open the stained glass door, with its brown and yellow figure of Melpomene, for Amaryllis to pass through, he became once more himself as he chose to figure in the world. When they got to their places, the auditorium was already in darkness, and as Blanchard put his hat under the seat, Sir Thomas Beecham assembled the wits of his orchestra with his eye. Blanchard fancied as he sat down that he made an incredible rustling with his clothes, and was breathing very loud. Then he heard Mr. Franklin at the end of the row murmur, "I don't know that I care much for this thing, but I have heard Valkyrie 18 times." A woman with short hair turned round and hissed. Far away down in the orchestra Sir Thomas Beecham tilted up his little beard, rattled his baton sharply, and raised his hands upon the first rhythm, and the overture of Boris Godunov began. One thing was clear to Blanchard: he was not comfortable. He remembered the general accusation against Englishmen at the opera, and settled himself with the least possible noise. But before he was prepared for it, the curtain went up, and at a distance across the immense dark amphitheatre he saw a spectacle of peasants singing in the snow. Persons of the nature of aldermen came out of a wooden house and addressed the crowd, and the draught from the wings bellowed the black cloth of the scene in and out, so that the castle and walls of the town wavered like sails on a slack breeze. All the time the music expanded out of the depth of the orchestral pit below the bright yellow glare of the footlights, in harmony like the rising of the sun, and the whole theatre, with its dusky golden balconies, crowded to the uttermost with vague forms, grew to the mind's eye immeasurably large, and became a vision of angels in their hierarchies, singing in a dim dream of heaven around the partly perceived glory of the throne of God. The theatre contracted to its usual size, and Blanchard realized it again as it was, and began to hear the drum insistent and too loud above the wind and strings. He noticed that the trombones were seated in one of the orchestra boxes and the double bass in the other, and he thought that it must be a very large orchestra, at which he was pleased, because he liked to visit places when anything unusual happened. He was not critical of art, but he began to wish that he could hear the music without witnessing the acting, and at that moment the curtain fell, the lights went up, and the crowded ranks of humanity became individual people. He could hear Mr. Franklin preparing to buy a program, and mechanically himself wrestled down into his trousers pocket for some money. But his pocket was tight, and Mrs. Franklin had already bought and paid for two before either of them had got out their cash. Blanchard drew out his hand and said to Amaryllis, "I think this is the very worst form of art, don't you, Amaryllis?" And as she replied, heard Mr. Franklin say to his wife, for the benefit of the program girl, "Dora, I don't like your necktie. Why did you come in that necktie to the opera? Why did you come in that necktie to Boris Godunov?" "It is not a necktie, it is a scarf," she retorted patiently, and he answered back, "Well, you wear it round your neck." The lights went out, and Blanchard, separating his thoughts from everything around him, allowed himself to fade into the deep twilight. Once more the music filled the whole of the theatre. Waves of sound followed through and over one another, and upon the pulsations of the time, which down below the rippling and gliding of the harmonies and rising and falling of the rhythm beat regularly as the blood against the ears. Blanchard's thoughts resolved themselves and came back to him in the music, and went out again and returned as if he were a dead man, floating, wave-washed in a sea. His head sank on his breast, he looked far off, and the oppressive emotion of parting with Susan came over him. He had but a faint impression of what was being enacted upon the stage. There seemed to be a few brightly colored figures in a large barn, but he took no account of them. After a time the rhythm of the music became more regular, the time quickened, and Blanchard saw two large Russian priests singing a song. One of the priests, who was very tall, was evidently drunk. His nose was red, his beard was bushy, and the music extraordinarily jovial. Presently the curtain fell, the music stopped, and the whole theatre clapped and shouted. Two diminutive figures of priests came out of the gigantic folds of the curtain before the footlights, bowed and vanished, reappeared with a little man and a little woman in colored clothes, and vanished, appeared alone, and vanished a third and fourth time, till at last the applause died away like a shower of hail, and the lights went on. People rose here and there all over the theatre. Blanchard had clapped loudest of all those near him, and had shouted also, but he did not know why, and now it was over and Amaryllis rose beside him, he got up hurriedly, and forcing himself back into their world, followed his companions out into the circular balcony. When they were under the dome, Mr. Franklin said irrelevantly to Amaryllis, "I have heard Walküre 18 times, and I consider it one of the world's greatest masterpieces." He smiled as if he were joking and went on, "I heard it last in Petrograd." His beautiful dark wife, to whom he was devoted and who was devoted to him, said, "Don't you think he might have seen something else for a change, Amaryllis?" Amaryllis laughed with her deep laughter and replied, "I should have thought so." Blanchard heard them joking, and heard Mr. Franklin state, "I think seriously it is a very fine work, a real work I mean, not a work in the usual sense of a piece of slavery." Blanchard did not remain to listen to what Amaryllis might say, but moved away by himself and looked over the balcony. Mary Laurie was talking with some friends, and he walked round the gallery uneasily, looking for somebody to converse with, as life meant nothing to him alone. He was bored. He looked over the well again at the people on the red plush settees in the foyer. A girl he knew, belonging to the upper classes, sat under the shadow of a little palm tree on King's side, but as he was not in the mood to bow to her, he drew back and stood upright. He could not help thinking of Susan. The next minute two Russians passed him, and a picture came into his mind of the Nevsky Prospect as he had last seen it, with a bitter cold wind whirling up the dust. He went round now to where Mary Laurie stood talking to two of her friends whom he also knew, and broke into the conversation. "One hears the most remarkable stories," said the man, and the woman who was with him answered, "Yes, one sees policemen and priests thrown together in threes into the river, and if anybody picks anybody's pocket in a train, which is quite usual, they form a court and try them then and there, and if they find them guilty, they throw them over the next bridge." Blanchard was annoyed with the woman for being enthusiastic, because enthusiasm seemed an intolerable vice to him that evening. He said, however, pretending to quote, "Here we sit on our plush settees, while Tchekhov's cherry orchards are avenged, and the beastly bourgeoisie, very Anglicki, are spat upon by village idiots." He laughed, and found to his embarrassment that he had come into the end of a conversation, and, as Mary Laurie said, "Well, I must go, there is somebody I must speak to over there," he moved away with her, smiling. Mary Laurie said, "I knew I would meet those people here tonight, but I had to speak to them," and he answered, "Yes, quite." He followed Mary Laurie as if he were a little boy, and went with her to speak to Consuelo Ferrand and the young man with the Russian beard, but catching sight of Louis with the painter, Conrad Hart, he went up to him and fell into conversation. Louis spoke of the priest's song, and suddenly Blanchard was relieved from the memory of Susan, and he felt the perfection that might be got out of being a man. He thought of mannishness, and the appropriate virtues conferred upon men by drunkenness, coarseness, and lusty wit, which in his eyes rendered men incomparably more magnificent than women, and gave them bass notes upon which to harmonize their flights into rarity and poetic fineness. and, in a word, comprised the nether end of lordship of creation. As he was about to be jovial with Mr. Lewis, the electric bell rang, his voice fell silent, and tired by his desultory communication with his kind, he went back into the auditorium and sat down, this time between Amaryllis and Mary Laurie. He was glad when the darkness came down again and the music began. He wished it would remain dark, and that the music would never cease. He thought of himself as sitting in a railway train at night, and hoped that there would be no stopping at brightly lit stations until he got to his destination. But what his destination was he did not know. He drew up his shoulders, his face became sad, his mouth relaxed, and his eyes gazed into nowhere. He was in profound doubt, not that of self-pity, but of humility, and, forgetting his worldly self, he became simple-hearted. Love music was in progress, and the very suggestion of love made him wish to cover his eyes and weep, but he held back his tears in his throat and kept at bay the deep emotions within him. Towards the middle of the next scene his humility began to be heroic, and he stirred where he sat as trees stir before the oncoming storm. During the next interval he went out in a dream, and came back having spoken to no one, entire in his heroic humility and that isolation of the human soul which is grand and bitter, and which, as the ages of the earth pass, becomes more unconquerable. He sighed in the darkness, and there rolled up and over him the terrible incomprehensible horror of the war, and he seemed to lose his spirit in it and become a part of it, as if he were a vaporous trail lost in a cloud of thunder. He did not comprehend what was upon him, but the sweat stood on his forehead, and he saw a great way off some formless vision. He drew himself close together, and a shudder passed over him. He no longer heard the music, nor saw what was happening around him. He fought with himself to control his emotions. He interlaced his fingers and locked them tight. He pressed his hands across his breast and braced his elbows back to give himself no room to tremble. He relaxed the whole of the rest of his body and breathed through the back of his throat for fear that he should sob out loud. Presently he forgot to control himself, and the necessity to hold himself in check passed. He yearned as in the old days men yearned after God, and knowing that this moment was rare and that an hour would bring back common life, he half turned to Mary and looked at her in deep dismay, as if to pray her to keep him for himself. Now he shut and opened his mouth with movements of childish helplessness, and turning from her gave himself up to consternation and the extreme ecstasy of astonishment. Mary saw his face transfigured as if he stood on a new Darien, witnessing a new Pacific. Beholding the beauty of his heart, she found in him the loveliness of men and women, and understood through him that all the sons and daughters of men are also the sons and daughters of divine creation. End of chapter 23, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.